called that, but here we go. So in general, for science sessions, we're on Google Meet. We're here with Dr. Nicolas Davidenko, who I will introduce in just a second. Misophonia event, online virtual event etiquette. You all are probably familiar with this, but if you can keep your camera off and mic on mute, unless you're speaking. So if you come on camera and ask a question, or you want to ask a question in the chat, please do so. This is to reduce any kind of unintentional activators that might make the event inaccessible. I should have changed that, but we've all been on Zoom meetings and there's somebody over in the corner who forgets that they're on camera and they're doing something that is very distracting. So we're just trying to limit that. Please keep questions. Please put your questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions for Dr. Davidenko or me or anybody else, feel free to put it in there and we'll ask them. Also, if there are any issues, please alert me to those. We try to make these as misophonia, misokinesia friendly as possible, but I may end up doing something. I have some sort of, like I said, my mic gets a little close to my mouth, and that understandably bugs a lot of people. Let me know in chat and we'll try to correct those things as well. Additionally, feel free to use the closed captioning in Google Meet. The reason we're using Google Meet is that it has automatic transcription. So at the bottom of your window below me here, or below the window that you're looking at, there's a little box that says CC. That's for closed captioning, which is handy. If there is anything that's bothering you audio-wise, you can put us on mute and you can read what we're saying. And a lot of times that can help quite a bit with the automatic transcription. And lastly, this event is being recorded. So you're all being recorded, just FYI, and we will be posting a video of this event on our website in the next day or two for free, and it'll be on YouTube as well. And if anything else comes up, please let us know. It's pretty informal. A little bit about our organization. You know, we're a nonprofit, and some of our biggest initiatives over the past year have been in the realm of research. We launched Misophonia student research grants earlier in the year in February. This is where we give out money, which I love doing. We hand out up to $1,200 to graduate students to fund their research about misophonia, misokinesia, and related conditions. You can learn more at soQuiet.org/grants. So far, it's been my pleasure to give out money to 4 graduate students this year for some exciting research that's coming up at the graduate student level. I think it's some really promising things, and we're happy to fund that. Misophonia Research Pool. This is the centralized Misophonia Research Participant Registry. What does that mean? A lot of people ask us, how do I participate in the kind of research that Dr. Davidenko and others are doing? How do I sign up to be a participant? And there really was never a good, clear answer for that. You can contact different organizations and different universities and hope to get on their list. So we created a centralized sign up for people who want to do that. And any new studies where you can be of service to the misophonia research community, we let you know about. So it's a centralized registry for that. It's also available to researchers to use. So if you're a researcher and you need people who have misophonia, you can contact us. And lastly, soQuiet science sessions. This is where you get to meet the misophonia researchers directly, learn about their latest work, which is what we're doing here. It's very meta, but we're happy to try to bridge that gap between the academic research community, which is kind of a bubble in itself, like it's academic, and bridge that gap between the general public so that you all, as part of the Misosphere, know what's happening in misophonia research. What's the latest that we know? What are the latest papers saying? And that's what this is here. We're doing these monthly so far, which is a lot of fun. And I enjoy learning a lot about it too. As a nonprofit, all of our programs are free thanks to our tax-deductible donations and our volunteers as well. If you want to keep all of our programs free and accessible, we would love to have a donation of any amount if you want, but that's not required. You can go to our website /donate, or this is kind of cool. You can actually text the word soQuiet to 53555 and donate on your phone while you're waiting at a stoplight. It's very easy to do. Lastly, if there's any questions, comments, or concerns you have, I'm always happy to answer questions. I answer every email that comes in. You can contact me and the rest of our board at hello@soQuiet.org. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Nicolas Davidenko. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm Nicolas Davidenko. I'm an associate professor of psychology at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And my lab examines high-level perception, which includes things like face perception and recognition, motion perception, interaction between sensory modalities, and top-down control over perception. So how does attention, expectations, beliefs, how do those things affect what we perceive? And that's sort of the angle at which we approach misophonia research as well.
Awesome, thanks. I put a link to your high-level perception lab and a little bit about you there. And the reason we're here today is you and your team published a paper on some work that you've been doing over the last couple of years. And I'm going to go ahead and link that as well if you want to read the actual paper that was published last month or within the last month or two. And this is on what we're going to be talking about today. So in general, as I understand it, I have a copy of it here too, so I'm going to be pulling some questions from it. I get to read it. Your work in general, before we get to the misophonia part, because I want to find out how you ended up researching misophonia, but your interests are in things like illusion and perceptions and maybe sort of tricking the brain, if that's an accurate way of putting it. And two things I want to I'll bring up later that really stuck in my mind when I was reading your paper, and I've watched the videos and kind of followed this study for a while now, are the concepts of misdirection. My first job ever was at a magic shop, which shouldn't surprise anybody. I was demonstrating magic tricks, and so the concept of misdirection as a psychological thing, as well as juxtaposition. So my background as well, when we're talking about film, like film editing, or we're talking about comic books, those two mediums really rely on the concept of juxtaposition, which is also tricking the brain into the observer putting together a story that doesn't actually exist because of how different images are placed together. And both of those are relevant to this study. But to pull that back a little bit, how did you end up coming up with this connection between the McGurk effect, which we'll explain what that is in a second, and misophonia, and how did you end up in this particular world based off of what the kind of background you have is?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's funny you mentioned magic, because as a kid, I was also very interested in magic. I took actually some lessons with a local magician and learned some sleight of hand, like making a thimble disappear, things like that. And I was always fascinated by that concept of misdirection. And a lot of the research I do, even outside of misophonia, shares this idea that we can kind of trick you can trick the mind, trick the brain into perceiving something that isn't there. And we're really interested in how the mind can trick itself. So some of the things we look at are motion percepts that aren't really there. We just tell people to see certain motion patterns, and they do. When the stimulus we present is random enough, people can kind of interject whatever they want to see onto it. And in terms of how we arrived at misophonia, so I worked with Dr. Pat Samermit. She was a postdoc in my lab who had done some research a while ago with Dr. Ramachandran at UC San Diego on synesthesia. And as part of that laboratory, she learned about misophonia as well. And we kind of came together with this realization that a lot of sounds are ambiguous. And sounds that are maybe unpleasant might not be so unpleasant if you think that they are a different sound. And we started with kind of universally disliked sounds, like scratching a chalkboard, for example. Like that gives most people like very negative bodily sensations and feelings of disgust and other unpleasant feelings. And we realized that we could, if you superimpose a video of somebody playing a flute or playing a violin note, but put that sound of chalkboard scratching behind it, it doesn't feel as bad. There's something about seeing the scratching that makes that sound feel worse. So it's as if it's not the sound itself that feels bad, it's the concept of what's producing the sound that produces the aggravation. So we published a paper about 3-4 years ago showing that these aversive sounds can be sort of attenuated, or at least the way people react to them can be attenuated by visual stimuli. And then we basically turned that around into a study of misophonia, people with misophonia, and trying to understand like their specific triggers and whether we can do something similar with misophonic triggers.
Interesting. Yeah, I was reminded of, I think most people who have misophonia, I'm getting the videos here queued up as well so we can watch them, have an experience like what I'm about to say. I was at the grocery store with my wife a month or so ago, and we're shopping, and I hear about 2 aisles over somebody clearly loudly popping their gum. And I'm sorry I mentioned that, but there's going to be actual talk about specific triggers in this event. There's nothing else we can do about that because it's so important. But that particular trigger is a big one for me. And I just, I had that normal misophonic reaction. And of course, I had to go check it out. I had to go see who it was that was doing this. So I go around the aisle. I found out it's not actually somebody doing that. It's somebody stocking the shelves, and they're cutting the bands, the tension bands off of boxes, which makes the exact same sound. And this wasn't a conscious decision, but the fact that I suddenly knew it wasn't what I thought it was, and that it would be over soon, there were only 2 more bands that needed to be cut, made it so that when I did hear that exact same sound shortly thereafter, I wasn't bothered by it, which really confused me. The sound hasn't changed, but the context for it has. And we're finding more and more through your study and through many others that source and context of a particular trigger are not intentionally, but very important in the severity of a misophonic reaction. And that's kind of where your study picks up. So I'm not quite sure the best way to introduce these videos. Do you mind if we go ahead and show a couple of them? I'll go ahead and share them.
Yeah.
Let me get one of them queued up. We'll do this one. Sorry, just a second here. I will also mention while we're doing this, I told Dr. Davidenko right before this that I'm on about an 11-year-old iMac. So if it goes a little slow, I apologize. I'm not sure what kind of caveat to give this. Let me pause it. But if you have misophonia, which I think probably, from what I understand, most of the people in the audience do, I would suggest go ahead and try watching these. And I'm saying that very tenuously because I have misophonia as well, and I have watched these previously and made the same discovery that Dr. Davidenko and his team did. So if you'll bear with me, I would say give it a shot. And if it's triggering, of course, you can turn it off or mute it. But here we go. I'm going to go ahead and do the first one, if you don't mind. And hopefully you can hear the audio on this. Let me mute myself. Okay, so that was the first video, somebody tearing paper, which can be a trigger for people, but is a pretty low level one in general. I'm very much overgeneralizing that. Now that we've watched that, and I watch a lot of classic rock videos as well now too, based on the recommendations. Tell us a little bit about that video. What's happening there? Why did we watch that?
Okay, so that is about a 12-second video clip of somebody tearing a piece of paper, but it's actually the sound in that video doesn't come from the paper tearing. It comes from that same person in a different video chewing on like a Frito chip, kind of like producing a crunchy chewing sound with their mouth that was specifically created to be temporally aligned with the paper tearing. So this is the kind of the difficult part of this endeavor, is to create the synchronization. But what you actually heard when you were watching that paper tearing wasn't the sound of paper tearing, but actually the sound of crunchy chewing.
That's pretty wild. Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious, we'll watch a couple of more. And again, the same caveat is here. But as somebody who, if I was actually watching the video of that person eating the chips, I would have had to have muted it and I would have left and probably would have been needed some time to calm down. But with the video synced to it of somebody tearing paper, which for me, paper crumpling and all of that can be a trigger, especially loud plastic. But I wasn't really bothered by it, and it's that misdirection where I feel like I've watched a magic trick. I don't know. Kind of blows my mind. Let's watch a couple of more. And again, now that the cat is out of the bag, that what we're watching is video with an alternate soundtrack. We'll watch a couple more. Let me go ahead and see if I can share these. Let me let this person in. Okay, let me share my screen here. A tab. Okay, that one, same kind of thing. That one for me was a little bit different because I think I could recognize what the sound was more than what the video was. But I guess it's also, I was expecting it. It's like the second time you watch a magic trick, once you know how it's done, it's not the same when you know the gimmick. But that was, of course, yep, what Mary Rachel said. I agree. That one, now that I kind of know that the cat is out of the bag, I think that sounds like somebody's slurping through a straw or something, or slurping a beverage.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly
okay.
Right.
All right. We'll do one more. And if these are bothering you, we'll just have one more. You can see when it's over with. And then we'll move on and talk a little bit more about the concepts behind it. We'll do one last one. Okay, that one was a little bit trickier. So yeah, what Mary Rachel said. I agree with her. It was someone sniffing, but again, we know what to expect this time. So so maybe it's a little bit of that. Oh, we already know what the magic trick is going to be. I didn't find that one as bothersome either. But this is interesting in that if we hadn't already set it up and kind of told you what the trick here is, and we were just watching these, which maybe in hindsight I should have done that, just showed them straight through. But I don't think you would have noticed as big a thing. And there's an interesting study you referenced that comes before yours by Mirren Edelstein that is sort of based off of this, where if we, in hers, there were just sounds, there weren't visuals per se. But in the study, she mentioned that of this sound set that people are listening to, and they had misophonia, some of the sounds came from animals, pet sounds, which some of us are triggered by, and some of us a lot less so, or not at all. And some of the other sounds were human sounds. And when the participants misjudged what the sound was and thought that a human-based sound was a animal-based sound, they were less likely to be triggered by it or less severely triggered by it. Do you think that that's a kind of involved in what you were doing here, only on a visual scale?
Oh yeah, the that research project by Edelstein and colleagues is very much in line with the work that we're doing, as well as a couple other papers that came out in the same issue of Frontiers last month. They're all about the role of interpretation in the misophonic response. So just as you mentioned, when people thought that it was a dog chewing rather than a human chewing, their responses were reduced, and vice versa too. So when it was actually the sound of a dog chewing, but they misjudged it as a human chewing, then their response was worse. So the idea that what you think the sound source is affects the way you respond to it is really coming up in the forefront in the latest studies that we've been seeing in the last couple of years.
I think it's a good point, and something that I is hard to describe. We're learning that misophonia and misokinesia are much more complex than we thought they were even 5 years ago. We thought it was well, at first we thought it was just kind of an OCD or something along those lines reaction. The earliest misophonia assessments, like the Amsterdam one, were based off of OCD assessments. But now we've learned more, and it's a lot more complex. And just a couple of years ago, we thought of it as more of a sensory processing disorder, an auditory processing disorder. But when we add on this unintentional subconscious, for lack of a better term, judgment that we aren't doing consciously on the trigger, who's making it, why we might subconsciously think that they're making it, what else is going on. It's really confusing. We don't know the answers to these things yet, but what is your take on where maybe this is going to be headed based off of what you found, and Maren Edelstein and some of these others that have pointed out context is important, but it's not a conscious judgment on the context?
Yeah, so where I think this is heading, I think that it's very important to know that context matters. And just to add to what you were saying, just to kind of expand on that a little bit, we are also in my lab, led by Dr. Pat Samermit, looking at results of large-scale interviews we conducted with folks where they talk about social norms and cultural norms and how important those are in determining the severity of their reaction. So, for example, if it's if somebody that they know well, who knows that they have misophonia, is the one producing the chewing sound, that's much worse in general than if it's somebody who had no idea that the person suffers from misophonia, or if it's somebody who can't be held accountable, like a child or a toddler or an animal or a pet doing similar sounds. So that the because we can't find any systematic differences in the sounds themselves that are produced either, intentionally or unintentionally, or by a child or by an adult, we know that it's these higher level conceptual judgments, like you said, or interpretations of what's happening, as it's tied with social cultural norms, expectations, concepts about politeness and rudeness, as well as one thing we're finding a lot is questions about control. Who's in control of the situation? What can the person do? What are they in control of over? So a lot of these kind of social cultural factors play a role. And so we're kind of moving away from thinking of misophonia as like a sound processing disorder and a much more complex set of phenomena, as you said.
Yeah, and your previous talk a year or so ago with Duke really set that in motion. You were the one who introduced me to the concept that it's a multisensory disorder, and that opened up for me, just as an outsider, opened up a lot of possibilities because the visual element is so important. I've always been curious. I don't know if this exists or if it would make any difference because this is a layperson's take on things. I would be curious if there are any people with misophonia who have been legally blind their entire life, and if it's as severe. I don't know how you would find somebody like that or if it would matter, but the context is such an important part of it. And one of the things that I have to admit is kind of true, even though I'm reluctant to, is that a lot of misophonia triggers are really just bad manners.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that make me not look so judgmental? Because I'm not doing it consciously. I'm not like saying you're a bad person or anything. It's just a part of how our brains are processing that sound. We're interpreting it as that's not socially acceptable
Mm-hmm.
within our subconscious brain.
Yeah, a lot of those judgments about what's good manners or bad manners or what's considered rude or not are so ingrained in us, right? That we learn these at a really young age, and that this is when misophonia usually starts developing at a younger age, and we know from lots of studies that it tends to start as a single person who is the source. So it might be a parent or a sibling who eats in a very loud way at the dinner table. That's the beginning of the misophonia. Then it can generalize to more people, to other situations, other sounds. But um, because it's tied to kind of concepts of rudeness and manners doesn't necessarily mean it's judgmental, right? Like it still comes from like a very early kind of childhood experiences, and the reactions are so quick. It's important to not necessarily assume that the person is making a judgment on the individual.
Yeah, and I think just in my own life, part of the thing that I have to be conscious of in that self-care, that self-regulation mode, and then we actually have some good questions I'll get to in just a second, is resentments. And I bring that up, it's a little bit tangential. I'm pretty open about my background. I got sober about 5 years ago, and working on like resentments for why we ended up in, self-medicating is a big part of recovery programs. And that's helped me in misophonia because triggers are oftentimes, subconsciously or not, a little bit judgmental, or we have some sort of immediate resentment towards the person making the sound or doing the thing, doing the motion. And you're right, if it's somebody who knows we have misophonia and they're doing it anyway, then the resentment is even more. You're like, I have this thing, why are you still doing this? And so working through, taking the time to kind of work through, they don't mean it. They're not doing it to spite me. Hopefully, they're not doing it to spite me. That's kind of manipulative if they are. But where do you think we're at a particular snapshot here in research, and every month is bringing new information that's great on misophonia. And so we have this snapshot of your work that's been ongoing in this paper, and you said that there's some things you've discovered since this paper was published just a couple of months ago. What are some of those new elements that you would like to add? And then we'll get to the questions.
Yeah, so maybe let me touch upon what you just said, because misophonia is also very heterogeneous, and the way that it presents across individuals. So you mentioned the importance of visual information, or like seeing the source of the sound, and we asked folks about that for them. Does it make it better if you're able to see the source of the sound, or does it make it worse? And for some people, it makes it actually worse. Some people, it makes it better to know what's causing the sound. And for some people, doesn't matter who makes the sound, and for other people, it really does matter who makes the sound, and it's very constrained to particular sources. So I think we're not going to ever have like a single all fits all kind of solution, because it presents in such different ways across people. But what is encouraging is that what we're doing, this kind of systematic way of deflecting or kind of redirecting people to kind of reinterpret sounds as something else, or just realize that they can. I think that's the most important aspect, is just realize, even if it was for a fleeting moment, that you are able to hear this sound and not have that typical reaction to it because you didn't know what it was, or because we tricked you or you tricked yourself into believing that it was something else. So some of the new data that we've been looking at now is people with misophonia who were part of our original pool, from which we took our interviews and described the sound set. They've now been called back to watch all of these videos, both the swapped videos like the ones you showed, as well as the original videos, and give us ratings. How do these make you feel? And what's really encouraging is that for the majority of participants with misophonia, they experience the swapped videos as a lot less aversive in general. And we still have some analysis to do because we are kind of averaging responses across a whole set of triggering sounds, but we know that individuals tend to have very specific triggering sounds. So I think that actually the results will look better than they look now, because we're going to hone in on the specific triggers and see how that visual context affects people with their specific triggers. And the last thing I'll say is that a vast majority of these folks are excited about this possibility that this could have kind of long-term effects, and are willingly and excitedly signing up for our 6-week intervention study, where we're going to do some kind of exposure counter conditioning with these videos, and also using some imagery exercises.
That'll be interesting. Yeah, that's one of those, I'm going to get to Barry's question here. One of those divisive topics in the mesosphere is exposure therapy, which has been turned out to be harmful to some people, but there are different types of exposure therapy, as I understand that. I'm not a physician or clinician or anything.
Yeah, so we're not, so yeah, exposure is probably not the best term for it, because we are, the better term in the literature is counter conditioning. So it involves exposure, but it involves also redirecting, creating a new association between the stimulus and the response, or between the stimulus and the interpretation. So when we present these videos, the goal is not to just to desensitize by process of just repeating sounds over and over again. The goal is to provide people with this alternative interpretation that has this immediate consequence of reducing the response.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what the results of that. Okay, I'm going to go to some of these questions. This is from Mary Petrie. She's got several questions, but they're all kind of tied together. When we consider that source and context are factors in one's reaction to a trigger, I wonder what we are pulling out of the environment to label as context. That's a good question. Context seems largely to be social or related to what's happening with people, cultural norms, and so on, textures of relationships. What if the context we need to explore is something else, some material property in the environment, like an acoustic or visual property? My experience is that all of those things are true. Maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, I agree that all of them are true. And so you can talk about different, I guess, levels of context, like social context, environmental context, like physical context. So you just to come back to the example, Chris, that you'd mentioned about the smacking gum that turned out to be these rubber bands. That's a physical difference, right? Like what is the physical mechanism for that sound, that popping sound, to be produced? In one case, it's something exploding, like the gum bubble exploding, right? In another case, it's like a rubber band snapping. That's a type of contextual difference. One is, and the same kind of thing, we've been thinking about this a lot with these universally disliked sounds. So for example, like nail scratching. That scratching, that grating kind of high friction contact between two surfaces is part of what's bothersome beyond the noise. And if we can come up with like a non-frictiony alternative that could produce a sound like that, I think that's what resolves that to a degree. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Mary adds, and then I'll move to Andrea's. Specifically, I wonder if visual movement overrides the movement of sound, and that's why the reactions differ. If I'm interpreting that correctly, it's a little bit, and tell me if I'm wrong, Mary, a little bit of what the Kumar study, even though there's been a few things added to that have changed a little bit since then, has to do with mirroring and our interpretations of other people's movements as we interpret them through our quote-unquote mirrored neurons. I think that's kind of what she's asking.
Chris, I'll say it wasn't not entirely. I mean, yes, there is that, but I'm also just curious about the movement of sound, and how an excellent point about context being many things, but the movement of sound. So perhaps we are, I don't know, we're so used to seeing things and getting our information visually, or maybe anatomically, the motion of sound overrides the motion or I'm sorry, the motion in visual perception dominates over the motion of sound waves, and that's why we're able to trick the brain.
Good question.
Yeah. So, I mean, anything that produces a sound has to move, right? So whether it's like a finger snapping or, two surfaces creating friction, sound is like produced by movement. It causes motion in airwaves, but those we can't really see. But usually the motion. So when we experience an event, it usually will involve visual changes as well as auditory events. So we see something visually changing, and we hear a sound. We assume that that sound is coming from that visual event, or But in the case, what we're doing, we're providing like a much more, let's say, explicit visual cue, right? So like the paper tearing, it's actually there's much more stuff happening visually with paper tearing than when somebody's chewing. Like there's much more motion, movement, visual change in one scenario over the other. And I think maybe this is what you're getting at, that if something has like a lot of visual change, it will attract our attention, and it will be easier to sort of focus on that and sort of even interpret that sound as being related to that than something that's making a much smaller visual change.
It's a great point. And I'm kind of reminded, again, going back to the juxtaposition thing, and then I'll get to Andrea's questions. We've always been fascinated by sound effects in films, which are usually not the sound of what we're seeing. So we'll see horses running, and we find out that it's actually some guy with some halved coconuts on a table, and that blows our mind because we could have sworn that it was the sound of hooves. Yeah, Foley artists, exactly, Mary Rachel. So that's a good point. I think there's definitely something to that. Andrea says, have you come across, this is a great question, and measured if the reverse effect was achieved, where the substituted action actually became triggering by association with the original triggering sound? Great question.
That's a great question, and we've been asked this question before, and we've been worried about this actually, because the last thing we want to do is create new triggers for people. And you mentioned, and this is something I also saw in the chat come up, which is part of this assumes that this alternative visual source is not triggering, right? Or is at least much less triggering. And so for folks for whom paper ripping is triggering, we would never want to use that stimulus. But it could also be this more unintended consequence that even for somebody who doesn't have paper tearing as a trigger, once they learn that the sound of paper tearing could be confused with the sound of chewing, we could get this opposite effect where now when they see somebody tearing paper, they associate that now with chewing, which actually produces a negative reaction where it didn't used to before. I don't have an answer to that, other than we think that we're careful about choosing these alternative stimuli that they're not triggering. They're also not necessarily everyday things, so it may not be that common that you would be exposed to somebody ripping paper, so it may be more tolerable. If it does become a trigger, it's a little bit more tolerable because it doesn't show up in your environment that often.
Good point. And there's a few, as somebody who works in the misophonia world as well, I really have to figure out, because there's a communicability or at least there's an suspected communicability anecdotally that's pretty much accepted, even though it hasn't been tested too much, that if I mention a particular trigger, that it might spur somebody else to acquire that subconsciously. And I don't know what the best answer is, because we have to talk about these things. But there are a few of probably my top misophonia triggers that I've never heard anybody else mention. I've never told anybody else because I'm afraid that they will go, oh, that is one. And it's not something that ever comes up. But I've never been able to talk about it with somebody because I'm afraid they'll get it. So it is kind of wild, and there's so much we don't know yet. One of the things that I did want to ask you about is there was a creative aspect to this, and I think there is actually maybe one more question that I'll get to in just a second. You all had to use some creativity in coming up with the matching videos. So you recorded known triggers and video of people making those triggers. That's easy to do. But then you had to pull together some brainstorming people and ask, hey, what are some other things that could plausibly make this sound? And then go and make videos that are queued up to that. So there's a little bit of an artistic side to it too. And is there more of that kind of, I always think of science as a creative thing, even though I don't think most people would, like designing a study and how to, for lack of a better word, trick people into thinking the study is about one thing when really you're testing for something else from a psychological aspect. Tell me a little bit about what that process was like and how maybe that can be used in the future too.
Yeah, so we first started with our own ideas. So we had the paper tearing idea, we had walking on snow, we had 5 or 6 things that we'd come up with. But then we wanted to expand our kind of database. So what we did was we presented sounds without video to participants and asked them to just guess what the source was. And 70-80% of the time they were correct in identifying the source, but we looked at those 20% of incorrect answers as potential sources of ideas. And then it just took a team of undergrads and grad students just brainstorming, listening to sounds, going out in nature and touching things, feeling things, and coming up with a lot of really cool ideas. I'll tell you a couple of them, and some of them are reflected in the video database. Like there's some people are triggered by pen clicking sounds. What we came, one of my research assistants came up with this idea of a spinning bicycle wheel. So if you put your bicycle upside down and spin the wheel, it goes tick, 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 tick. And it sounds a lot like it would sound if a person is clicking that pen, but there's just something actually kind of pleasant about that sound when it's the bicycle wheel going around. And so that's that's how that idea just popped up. They heard the bicycle wheel and they thought, oh wait, this sounds a lot like that. So there's not really much of a method except this idea of just asking people what they think the sound is and then seeing if we can start from those points. But it is a very creative process. We've never communicated with Foley artists like that was mentioned before, but like they must have some great ideas for substitutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Pen clicking is probably one of the top ones for me and that we hear about. We're actually going to a mental health conference here in Missouri this weekend to represent soQuiet, and we got some pens that don't click with our logo on them. That's how we're advertising them. Wrapping up a couple of things. One of the other points that you make in here that also comes from other studies, Dr. Ward in UK and so forth have done this, that adjusting the quality of the sound actually has a fair amount of impact on it. And so I've taken some of these tests, but they'll take what is normally a very triggering sound and adjust the pitch, adjust the tone, adjust the speed of it. And even though the sound is the same, there's a point where it gets far enough away from the original sound to where it's tolerable for people with misophonia, and they're testing that. So I'm wondering if that maybe is a part of the next step of what you're testing, or there might actually be therapeutic qualities to that, wherein instead of us wearing noise canceling headphones, we're wearing specific noise adjusting headphones or something. I don't know. I'm just brainstorming, but that's an interesting point you bring up on the quality of the sound, and how does that relate to maybe what you've worked on?
Yeah, well, so I haven't seen sort of very systematic data on that. I know that the group in Amsterdam has been working with folks doing their own sound manipulations. So slowing down the video or speeding it up or changing the pitch, like you mentioned, and those things tend to help. Partly, I think, because you get away from the sound, but also partly because it provides a chance for the person to exert control over it. The ability, like I said, the ability to control it is important. But I think that ultimately we want to have, we want to give people a coping mechanism that they can use in real life when they are actually hearing the sound, right? So I don't know if there's, your headphone or noise canceling or noise adjusting technologies that could take like a chewing sound and transform it in real time in such a way that it becomes less triggering. But if you can use your own mind to hear that sound and picture somebody stepping on leaves or tearing paper, then it may not be necessary to modify the sound as long as you're able to sort of compartmentalize it in your mind and listen to it as something else. But I think that there still is a lot of room for technologies to improve noise canceling technologies that might be designed specifically for misophonia.
Very cool. Any other questions that we have? This has been really fascinating, and I was talking to Dr. Rosenthal, Zach Rosenthal from Duke. He was hoping to maybe be here to kind of comment on some clinical aspects of it. But the way I interpret it is the work that you were doing and this McGurk effect juxtaposition aspect of psychology that you found is incredibly interesting and is more of a valuable clue in the case that may become much more clear later on down the line as treatments are put together how important this is. We're just not sure which direction that's going yet. Do you think that's a pretty safe way to say it?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we have a particular idea of how some therapeutic use of this could work, and this kind of ties into this idea of imagery. So one thing is to sort of have that visual alternative in front of you as a aid for you to reinterpret the sound. But what if, what happens once right? So like in the audience, when they first saw the first example video, it may have been the most effective because they didn't know about the trick. But then they saw the second video, even if it's a new sound, a new visual stimulus, they know that there's something nefarious going on, right? Mm-hmm. So what is the role of that knowledge, and can we counteract it? So can people sort of like, well, okay, that's what it is, but try to not remember that, try to think of that as if it weren't that. How good are people at doing that when the visual alternative is there, when the visual alternative is not there, and then when the true visual source is there? That's the toughest challenge. But I think sort of a progressive set of steps that gets people to be able to do that reinterpretation closer and closer to the real life stimulus is what we hope will eventually turn into some kind of intervention.
It's very compelling. That's all the questions we have. If anybody else, Mary Rachel has raised her hand. Do you want to come on and ask a question?
I'm going to put I'm like God from above. Hi.
Sure, go ahead.
I wanted to thank you so much, Chris, of course, for hosting, and everyone for being here, and of course, Dr. Davidenko. Did I say that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So I'm a misophonia sufferer, and it's gotten worse as I've gotten older. But I just wanted to ask, what I think you're doing is fascinating as far as the sound manipulation. And my first job was actually in LA. I'm a casting director now, was running a sound design studio, sound design, music mixing for feature films and commercials. And I met all the Foley artists, and sound is so important in life in general, right? Mm-hmm. What you're doing as far as, can I just not think that's got to be that woman next door popping her Dorito bag. That's the sound. Can I want to like literally like kill that person, like that. That's the feeling. They're so annoying, blah, 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 blah. The found that if I can associate that with something else and not feel the same is just amazing and fascinating. Can I please come work with you? The other thing is, I'm at the point where I'm struggling. I think other people are. I have a 12-year-old daughter, and she's at a really interesting age, emotionally, hormonally, all these things. She knows I have misophonia. She hates it, of course. On the one hand, she can be protective and understanding. On the other hand, she just does it on purpose to the point where I'm literally like, ah! And I have to like go, like I'm the Hulk, and I have to go in my room and cool down. And it's not cool. So are there any studies coming up about, or any little trick you think I could use that would help feeling right now, like, okay, I know she's trying to, instead of being like, oh my God, and let her like get to me, right? It's like one of those people that bait you in your life. Or is there any studies coming up to help with that emotion? Because it's really something I'm struggling with, and I don't know if anyone else is experiencing those things, but it's very scary, and I don't want to feel that way, you know?
Yeah. That's yeah, it's a difficult situation. I mean, there's a big component of this that's about relationships, right? And it seems I yeah, since I don't come from a clinical psychology background, I can't, kind of give you specific answers, but like there's more like interpersonal stuff there, I think, than the sounds alone, right? Sort of having to do with like, is this being done on purpose? Is this it's kind of like doing to specifically trigger you? So yeah, I don't have.
You know,
I don't have.
there's a
Yeah.
psychological element. There's that sort
Mhm.
of wah, 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 right? What could I be like? Pretend that she's, but that being said, the triggers are still there, that she's doing these certain
Right.
noises with her mouth, making a popping sound. One thing, she can be a total jerk, and I am 100% in agreement that the triggers that we're having, and I don't think we talk about it enough, is manners. 100% etiquette. I
Mhm.
grew up in England, where we did
Mhm.
not put our teeth on our utensils. We did
Mhm.
not slurp. We did not slouch. We did
Mhm.
not eat with our mouth. No, like, go away if you want to be a buffalo in the undergrowth. So I feel like etiquette and manners really do need to be addressed. And I love that you brought that up, Chris. I really do, because it's so important and it's not talked about. Like, no one wants to listen to you slurping on your stuff, whether at work or whatever. Like, there's just an etiquette part of it. And I think people don't realize, like, have some manners. Go eat your celery outside, or your stinky rotten eggs. Like, you just don't eat fish in an office. You know what I mean? Or you don't like
Yeah.
eat, like, there's an
Right.
etiquette. So I think
Yeah.
that needs to be addressed as well.
I think so, and I think you're totally right that manners is a huge component of this, and this is an opportunity. I think misophonia is still not that well known across in the general public, even though it's so prevalent. But increasing awareness of misophonia and then making folks understand what it feels like for the misophonia sufferer. I think there's some good to be done in having people just know that and maybe adjust their manners accordingly, especially if they know they're with somebody who can be triggered in that way.
Yeah, that's a good point. And my hunch is, since we're finding that misophonia is pretty complicated, it involves a lot of different aspects of a lot of different things. When we get to treatments, it'll be a combination of things. There's not going to be a magic pill that we find that cures misophonia. I hate to tell everybody that, but it's going to be each person will have a toolkit of certain types of therapy. There's research quite a bit into CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and DBT as one of the things in that toolkit. Along with maybe a medication somewhere down in the future, and along with maybe some desensitization, according to Dr. Davidenko's work. And who knows what that is, but there's going to be a variety of things that each person can put together to get by and do the kinds of things they need to do in life to be happy, that they may not be able to do with the misophonia so much. So that's kind of our time where we can go ahead and start wrapping up. Thank you so much, Dr. Davidenko. This has been something I've been really interested in from the first time I learned about your studies, you and Pat, and this new paper really puts a lot of it into context for me.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And especially the idea of the misdirection and juxtaposition that we talked about. And I will definitely put this video up online in the next couple of days for free on our website and our YouTube channel. If you have any more questions, you can reach out to Dr. Davidenko or myself, or anybody that we talk to. If something comes to you, tonight, and you think, oh, I should have asked him this, feel free to reach out. I'm going to post a survey. This is just an event survey on if there's anything we can do better next time. Like I say, so far we've been doing these monthly with so much research coming out. This new paper from Dr. Davidenko and his team just came out within the last month or so. And I know there's more on the way in the next couple of months. So we'll be hoping to do these free sessions each month. Thank you so much for your time. This has been really eye-opening. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Very interesting work. I'm definitely interested to see what happens in the next few years, because it's going to be a whole whole different story a year from now, I think.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. I just wanted to quickly mention that this work that we're doing is funded by the Misophonia Research Fund. They've put out a whole cycle of grants to support misophonia research. So we're really grateful to them for supporting our work, and we hope to keep working with them in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've talked to them before. They're great folks. They have another round of studies that's going to be funding coming up very soon. I'm excited to see what those are, what the next steps will be in the next year or two. So yeah, excellent point. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Davidenko.
Thank you,
much
Chris.
appreciated for your time. Yeah,
Thank you
y'all
so
take
much.
care. Have a great rest of your afternoons.